Hello, boys and girls. Happy Wednesday, April 7th. No, April 6th. Today's April 6th. Yesterday was Cinco de Mayo, which is April 5th. So today is the 6th. Welcome back. I hope you guys had a great day yesterday. Lucy is our superstar today, although Lucy might be postponing her video. Her brother's birthday was yesterday and it was a busy day for her. So if you don't see a video from Lucy, it will come next week. So don't fret and do not fear. I want to give you a fun joke. What should you give a pig who has a rash? What should you give a pig who has a rash? Some ointment. Instead of ointment, you give oinkment. All right, I'm going to continue to read to you from Gooniebird Green. If we remembered yesterday, the teacher had just said, today we are going to continue talking about stories. You remember, there's our Gooniebird Green. She's our new member of the second grade class. On Thursday afternoon, yay, the second grader said in a very loud voice, but all but Felicia Ann, who never spoke, and Malcolm, who wasn't paying attention, he was under his desk, as usual. Gooniebird, you weren't here for the first month of school, but our class has been learning about what makes good stories, haven't we? Mrs. Pigeon said. Everyone nodded, all but Malcolm, who was under his desk, doing something with scissors. Class, what does a story need most of all? Who remembers? Mrs. Pigeon had her chalk hand in the air, ready to write something on the board. The children were silent for a minute. They were thinking. Finally, Chelsea raised her hand. Chelsea, what does a story need? A book, Chelsea said. Mrs. Pigeon put her chalk hand down. There are many stories that don't need a book, she said pleasantly. Aren't there, class? If your grandma tells you a story about when she was a little girl, she doesn't have that story in a book, does she? The class stared at her, all but Malcolm, who was still under his desk, and Felicia Ann, who always looked at the floor, never raised her hand, and never spoke. Beanie said, my grandma lives in Boston. Kiko said, my grandma lives in Honolulu. Ben said proudly, my grandma lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Tricia shouted, my grandma's very rich. Class, said Mrs. Pigeon. Shh. Then in a quieter voice, she explained, another time we will talk about our families, but right now, she stopped talking and looked at Barry Tuckerman. Barry was up on his knees in his seat, and his hand was waving in the air as hard as he could make it wave. Barry, Mrs. Pigeon asked, do you have something that you simply have to say? Something that cannot possibly wait? Barry nodded. His hand waved. And what is so important? Barry stood up beside his desk. Barry Tuckerman liked to make very important speeches, and they always required that he stand. My grandma, Barry Tuckerman said, went to jail once. She was 20 years old, and she went to jail for civil disobedience. Then Barry sat down. Thank you, Barry. Now look at what I'm writing on the board. Who can read this word? Everyone, all but Malcolm and Felicia Ann, watched as she wrote the long word. Then they shouted it out. Beginning. Yes, Mrs. Pigeon said. Now I'm sure you all know this one. She wrote it on the board again. All right, let's see if you guys can figure it out. Every story needs these things. First is a beginning, then comes the middle, and finally comes the end. Oh my goodness, we just wrote small moment stories that had a beginning, middle, and end, and this author and teacher are talking about beginning, middle, and end in their book too. Middle, the children shouted. Good, and you can guess what the last word will be. She held up the chalk and waited. End. Correct, Mrs. Pigeon said. Good for you, second graders. These are the parts that a story needs, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now I'm going to write another very long word on the board. Let's see what good readers you are. She wrote a C, then an H. Mrs. Pigeon, someone called. She wrote an A and then an R. Mrs. Pigeon, several children were calling now. She turned to see what was so important. Malcolm was standing beside his desk, and he was crying. Malcolm needs to go to the nurse, Mrs. Pigeon, Beanie said. Mrs. Pigeon went to Malcolm and knelt down beside him. What's the trouble, Malcolm? She asked, but he couldn't stop crying. I know, Nicholas said. Nicholas always knew everything, and his desk was beside Malcolm's. Tell me, Nicholas, remember Kiko showed us how to make an origami star? All of the second graders reached into their desks and their pockets and their lunch boxes. There were these tiny stars everywhere. Kiko had shown them how to make the origami stars out of small strips of paper. The stars were very easy to make. The school janitor had complained just last Friday that he was sweeping up hundreds of origami stars. Malcolm put one in his nose, Nicholas said, and now he can't get it out. There's a picture of Malcolm. He doesn't look very happy, does he? Is that correct, Malcolm? Mrs. Pigeon asked. Malcolm nodded and wiped his eyes. Don't sniff, Malcolm. Do not sniff. That is an order. She took his hand and walked him to the classroom door. She turned to the class. Children, she said, I am going to be gone for exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds while I walk with Malcolm to the nurse's office down the hall. Stay in your seats while I'm gone. Think about the word character. We're learning about characters too. A character is what a story needs. When I come back from the nurse's office, we are going to create a story together. You must choose who the main character will be. Talk among yourselves quietly. Think about interesting characters like Abraham Lincoln or perhaps Christopher Columbus or Babe Ruth, said Ben. Yes, Babe Ruth is a possibility. I'll be right back. Mrs. Pigeon left the classroom with Malcolm. Ooh, I love that they're talking about beginning, middle, and end. And poor Malcolm, I hope he's okay. Tomorrow we'll find out what happens with Malcolm. Have a wonderful Wednesday, boys and girls.